Picture this. It's December 1944. Snow is falling hard over a dark forest in Belgium. American soldiers are half asleep in freezing foxholes, thinking the war is almost over. Then the ground begins to shake. Artillery tears through the trees. German tanks roll forward through the fog. Radios go silent. Front lines collapse. In a matter of hours, the Allies are pushed back, and Adolf Hitler believes he has just launched the attack that will change everything. But what he didn't know was that this gamble, made through snow and steel, would instead shatter his last real chance to win in the West. Welcome back to History Plus. Today we're diving deep into one of the most dramatic turning points of World War II, the relief that broke Hitler's final offensive. If you value clear, powerful war stories told in a way that actually makes sense, make sure you hit like and subscribe right now. It really helps the channel grow, and it tells me you want more stories like this. By late 1944, Germany was under massive pressure. Allied forces had landed in Normandy in June. Paris had been liberated. American and British troops were pushing toward Germany's western border. The Luftwaffe had lost control of the skies. German cities were being bombed almost daily. Fuel shortages were already severe. The war was not going well. But Adolf Hitler refused to think in terms of defeat. He believed that one bold move could break Allied unity. He believed that American soldiers were not prepared for a long winter fight, and most of all, he believed surprise could still win wars. The plan was daring and dangerous. German forces would attack through the Ardennes forest, a region of hills, thick woods, and narrow roads in Belgium and Luxembourg. The Allies considered it a quiet sector. Many American units stationed there were inexperienced or recovering from earlier fighting. The terrain was difficult, which made it unlikely, in Allied thinking, that Germany would attempt a major armored attack there. That assumption would prove costly. Before dawn on December 16, 1944, thousands of German artillery guns opened fire. Shells crashed into American positions across a wide front. Communication lines were destroyed. Units were cut off. Under cover of thick fog and low winter clouds, German infantry and panzer divisions advanced. The weather was critical. Heavy cloud cover grounded Allied aircraft. Normally, American air power would have quickly targeted German columns. But in those first days, the sky belonged to the storm. German forces pushed forward with surprising speed. American lines bent backward. Entire regiments were forced to retreat. Confusion spread across the frozen landscape. Roads clogged with trucks, jeeps, and artillery pieces trying to reposition. In some areas, German troops wearing captured American uniforms slipped behind lines to create chaos and misinformation. Within days, the German attack created a deep bulge in the Allied front. When commanders looked at their situation maps, they saw a large curve pushed westward into their territory. That bulge would give the battle its name. For Hitler, this was the moment he had hoped for. The objective was ambitious. German forces aimed to cross the Meuse River and capture the port of Antwerp. If successful, it would split British and American armies, disrupt supply lines, and possibly force political negotiations. It was a massive gamble. Germany committed some of its last strong armored divisions to this operation. These were experienced units. Many were veterans of earlier campaigns, but they also consumed enormous amounts of fuel. Fuel Germany did not have in abundance. In the early phase, the shock worked. American troops were caught off guard. Some surrendered after being surrounded. Others fought fiercely in isolated pockets. Small defensive stands slowed German progress in key road junctions and villages. Even a few hours of resistance in the Ardennes could disrupt the tight timetable of the offensive. One of the most important locations on the map was a small Belgian town called Bastogne. It wasn't large, but it was a crossroads. Several major roads ran through it. If the Germans controlled Bastogne, they could move supplies and armored units more easily through the region. American commanders recognized its importance immediately. Units from the 101st Airborne Division and other formations were rushed into Bastogne. They arrived in freezing conditions with limited winter clothing and incomplete supplies. Snow continued to fall. The cold was relentless. Soon, German forces surrounded the town from nearly all sides. The defenders were cut off. German commanders demanded surrender. They believed the Americans had no chance. Surrounded, outnumbered, low on supplies, the situation looked hopeless from the outside. The American response became famous. One word: nuts. Behind that word, though, was intense suffering. Soldiers dug foxholes in frozen ground. Wounded. Men filled makeshift aid stations. Artillery shells exploded day and night. Food and ammunition were rationed carefully. The cold seeped into everything: boots, rifles, skin. Still, Bastogne held. While the town endured siege, something crucial was happening elsewhere. General George Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, was pushing east in a different sector. When news of the German breakthrough reached him, he proposed a bold maneuver. Instead of continuing forward, he would pivot his entire army north toward Bastogne. Turning an entire army in winter conditions was no small task. Roads were icy, traffic was heavy, fuel had to be carefully managed. But Patton moved quickly. Thousands of vehicles shifted direction. Infantry, artillery, and tanks began racing toward the encircled town. This movement would become one of the most remarkable operational maneuvers of the war. At the same time, the weather began to change. The thick fog that had protected the German advance slowly lifted. Clearer skies returned. Allied aircraft roared back into action. Fighter bombers attacked German supply columns moving along narrow forest roads. Bridges were bombed. Fuel trucks exploded in bright orange fire against white snow. Fuel shortages began to hit German armored units hard. Some tanks were abandoned when they ran dry. Others were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. The offensive depended on speed. Without speed, it lost power. Inside German headquarters, tension grew. Reports described resistance stronger than expected. Timelines slipped. Casualty numbers rose. The deeper German forces pushed, the longer and more fragile their supply lines became. Momentum, the invisible force that drives successful offensives, began to fade. For soldiers on the ground, the change was subtle at first. Instead of advancing rapidly, units slowed. Instead of clear orders to push west, commanders began worrying about holding flanks and protecting supply routes. Every mile forward now required more effort. In Bastogne, the situation was reaching a critical point. Supplies were dangerously low. Medical teams worked without rest. The cold was merciless. Yet morale held firm because the defenders believed relief was coming. And it was. By December 26th, Patton's leading elements broke through to Bastogne. The encirclement was not completely eliminated overnight, but a corridor was opened. The psychological impact was enormous. What had been a German success story now looked different. The relief of Bastogne did more than save one town. It shattered the perception of unstoppable German momentum. Allied forces were reorganizing rapidly along the northern and southern edges of the Bulge. British units reinforced key positions. American divisions attacked German flanks. Air superiority intensified as weather improved. German supply lines were under constant pressure. Hitler refused to authorize major withdrawals. He believed that continued pressure might still produce a breakthrough. But battlefield reality told another story. Germany had committed elite divisions and precious fuel reserves. Losses were mounting. Replacement equipment was limited. Industrial production inside Germany was already strained by constant bombing. The offensive had reached its peak. From this point forward, it would begin to contract. Through snow and steel, the relief at Bastogne marked the moment the gamble began to collapse. It did not end the battle immediately. Fighting would continue, for weeks, but the direction had changed. The maps inside headquarters were about to be redrawn again, and once they began reversing, they would not stop. This was only the first phase of how the relief shattered Hitler's offensive. In the next part, we will step inside the German command structure as reality sets in, and we will see how the shrinking Bulge became a symbol of a collapsing war effort. The freezing wind swept through the Ardennes as German commanders realized that their bold gamble was starting to unravel. Inside their headquarters, Maps were spread across tables, red and blue lines marking advances and retreats. At first, officers clung to hope. Perhaps the Americans would falter. Perhaps the fog and snow would slow Patton's relief. But reports kept coming in. Bastogne still held. Resistance remained fierce, and supply lines were crumbling under relentless Allied attacks. Every mile the German advance had gained now felt increasingly fragile. Inside the encircled town, American soldiers of the 101st Airborne were holding their ground with stubborn determination. Snow fell heavier. Temperatures dipped lower, yet morale remained surprisingly high. Medical officers tended to the wounded as artillery shells screamed overhead, and soldiers rationed food, ammunition, and even warmth. The word nuts echoed, not as a joke but as a statement of defiance. History Plus often reminds us, moments like these are where the spirit of soldiers can influence the outcome of entire campaigns. Meanwhile, General George Patton's Third Army moved with extraordinary precision. Thousands of vehicles, artillery pieces, and troops maneuvered through narrow, icy roads. Engines roared, drivers skidded but persisted, supply officers coordinated fuel carefully to ensure armored units could push forward. Patton understood that speed wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Relief had to arrive before the Germans realized that their overextension was their own undoing. As American forces drew closer, the German offensive began to show cracks. Fuel shortages became acute. Tanks abandoned in snowdrifts were left as stark monuments to a plan that had underestimated both terrain and determination. Artillery units found themselves stranded. Infantry was forced to dig in while desperately trying to maintain momentum. Even elite divisions could not overcome these constraints. By December 24th, the encircled Americans in Bastogne began receiving limited supplies through airdrops, giving them enough strength to continue defending their positions. From the German perspective, this small corridor of resistance was a massive blow. Each day the town held, their timetable slipped further. Orders from Hitler demanded relentless pressure, but field commanders now faced the grim reality that continuing the offensive without sufficient resources could lead to disaster. Air superiority, once grounded by fog, returned in force. Allied fighters and bombers swept across the Ardennes, targeting bridges, roads, and supply convoys. German units, slowed by snow and fuel scarcity, were now vulnerable to constant harassment from the sky. The very weather that had initially protected the advance now worked against it. Every push forward became costlier. Every mile gained was contested with increasing casualties. Inside Bastogne, small victories had immense impact. Soldiers repelled German patrols. Snipers disrupted movements. Engineers repaired roads and fortifications despite the bitter cold. Communication lines were restored in fragments, connecting defensive units and enabling coordination with Patton's approaching forces. The arrival of artillery support from surrounding areas strengthened the defense, creating a growing sense of inevitability. The German plan was faltering. Back at Antwerp, German headquarters, reports were grim. The Red Army in the east was pressing, stretching resources even thinner. Fuel reserves were measured in days, not weeks. Commanders realized that continued aggression without pause was unsustainable. Yet retreat was politically unacceptable. Orders from Berlin allowed no flexibility. Generals knew that the offensive's failure was becoming visible, and the psychological impact on troops could not be underestimated. By December 26th, the first elements of Patton's Third Army reached Bastogne, connecting with the 101st Airborne. The encirclement was partially lifted. The Germans still held surrounding areas, but the tide had shifted. Momentum, the invisible yet decisive force of warfare, now belonged to the Allies. Snow, steel, and the relentless determination of American forces had begun to break the offensive. History Plus teaches us that war is rarely decided by a single battle or moment. It is often the accumulation of initiative, resilience, and timing. The relief at Bastogne marked a turning point not only for the Ardennes, but for the broader Western Front. The German gamble had collapsed under its own weight, and the war in Europe was increasingly slipping from Hitler's grasp. The next part will take us deeper into the German command's growing despair, showing how overextension, miscalculation, and Allied resilience forced decisions that would change the course of history forever. If you want, I can immediately write Part 3 next, keeping it concise but gripping for maximum retention. Do you want me to do that? Snow crunched beneath boots as German soldiers realized their advance was stalling. Supplies ran low, and tanks that had once rolled confidently through the Ardennes now sat immobilized in drifts of ice and mud. Every attempt to push forward met stiff resistance, artillery fire, and snipers hidden in the trees. The winter, once thought to favor the German offensive, now worked against them. Inside Bastogne, the Americans remained defiant. The 101st Airborne coordinated with artillery units outside the town, striking at German flanks and slowing their movement. Small pockets of resistance outside the town forced German commanders to divert precious forces, stretching already thin units even further. History Plus often emphasizes, it's these small but relentless actions that can determine the fate of a battle. Patton's Third Army advanced steadily, their movement a combination of daring and careful logistics. Frozen roads, fog, and enemy fire could not stop them. Every mile gained brought relief to the encircled troops, and every day the Germans held back was a day they lost momentum. The concept of initiative, once a German advantage, had shifted decisively. By late December, the German offensive had lost its rhythm. Plans that had seemed ambitious now appeared desperate. Commanders faced the bitter reality that their fuel shortages, stretched lines, and relentless Allied pressure were unsustainable. The maps that had once shown advancing red lines now reflected a stalled advance. The tide of the battle had shifted, and with it the broader war in the West. In the next part, we'll explore the final unraveling of the German offensive and how the relief at Bastogne became a symbol of Allied resilience and tactical brilliance. The German command grew increasingly frantic. Reports of stalled advances and abandoned tanks filled the headquarters, and morale among officers began to falter. The Ardennes offensive, once a symbol of German daring, now appeared to be collapsing under its own weight. Field commanders were forced to make difficult choices, continue pressing forward at enormous risk or risk defying orders from Berlin. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne and supporting units held their ground with remarkable tenacity. Snow piled high against barricades, artillery shells pounded the town, and yet the defenders refused to yield. Small counterattacks disrupted German movements, forcing them to fight inch by inch for every road and village. Every successful defense boosted American morale and weakened the momentum of the German assault. History Plus highlights that moments like these demonstrate how courage and coordination can tip the scales in warfare. Patton's forces pressed on relentlessly. Tanks, infantry, and artillery converged on Bastogne, exploiting gaps in German lines caused by overextension and supply shortages. The closer they got, the more German commanders realized their plan was unraveling. Roads choked with stranded vehicles slowed the offensive, and airstrikes destroyed critical supplies. The carefully orchestrated attack that had once threatened to split the Allied front was now on the defensive. By December 26th, relief finally reached Bastogne. Encirclement was broken, and the German advance stalled completely. The momentum that had once seemed unstoppable now belonged to the Allies. What had begun as a bold gamble had turned into a costly failure for Germany. Commanders in Berlin faced the bitter truth. Their last real chance to change the course of the war in the West had been shattered. The next part will conclude this story, showing how the battle's outcome reshaped the Western Front and marked a turning point that the Germans could no longer ignore.